Well, this is analysis of Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner, an American historian, presented a paper at the Chicago World's Fair entitled, quote, "The Significance of Frontier in American History." The Frontier Thesis dramatically altered the course of historical inquiry by rejecting the accepted method of understanding American history. Prior to the Turner Thesis, historians believed that the American experience could best be understood by studying the alteration of European germs, it's called the germ theory, in the American environment. That is, American history was viewed as a reaction to what was going on in Europe rather than anything new or different. Turner suggested that the proper way to understand U.S. history was by studying the impact of the frontier on American institutions. In his own words, he says, quote, "The existence of an area of free land, its continual recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development." Turner is going to, here we go. Turner is going to define frontier as, quote, "the meeting point between savagery and civilization, as opposed to the European concept of the frontier being the established fortified boundaries between developed states." This meant that the American frontier advanced along a single discernible line, and that American institutions underwent a constant rebirth by being continuously thrown back into a primitive state. In Turner's words, he says, quote, "This perennial rebirth, its fluidity in American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnished the forces dominating American character." As Turner saw the frontier experience as the primary reason why Americans were individualistic, materialistic, ingenious, rigorous, and democratic. On the frontier, new immigrants discarded their old ways and emerged as, quote, "Americans, a unique, new, and improved breed of man." Because of the lure of the frontier, Turner believed that Eastern institutions were altered to become more democratic to prevent loss of population to the West. He saw the frontier process as one of evolutionary development, repeated again and again on each successive frontier. The hunter was followed by the trapper and miner, who in turn was replaced by the pioneer farmer, who in turn gave away to the specialized farmer, who in turn yielded to the town or the city dweller. So the way you want to think of it, class, is you want to think of, all right, don't have, let me look here. No, that's not it. Okay, no problem. I'll just use my pointer here. Okay, so imagine, if you will, on a sheet of paper, if you draw a line. Okay, you draw a line, and on one side of the line, you have civilization. Okay, so that means you have Western civilization. That means you have established government, you have a working economy, right? You've got institutions that are essentially, my wife's being loud, I'm sorry. So you got this line, and on one side you got civilization, where you've got institutions that have been created to regulate the political, economic, and social lives of people, right? You've got a strong degree of technology, development, progress. On the other side of that line is what Turner called savagery. Savagery. And so savagery, so there's a line, and that's the frontier line. And the second you cross that line, you're leaving civilization and you're entering the frontier. You're entering savagery. Savagery means there's nothing. There are no institutions. There's no economy. There's no established law. You are basically subject to, and you're dependent on your ability to survive in a land without uh, the benefits of civilization. All right. So what he's saying is that every time Americans, the story of America is the fact that this line is constantly receding to the west. Right. That line. So that line, by the way, started in 1607 with Jamestown. So when colonial Americans stepped off the boat and onto the beach, they're stepping right into savagery. They're entering a continent, North America, that has zero civilization. Okay, or Western civilization. Okay, European civilization. It's got nothing. Okay, so what they're having to do is they're stepping off the boat onto the beach, and they're having to start civilization over. They're having to build something new in an area that has nothing. Okay, so they're building civilization. So as colonial Americans, as they built civilization, as they brought civilization to a savage land, they created a place that was different, that was new. It wasn't like what you had in Europe. All right. So the way Turner sees history, American history, is that it's really traced by the constant recession of that line westward. And that what Americans have done over the course of history is that we've left civilization, we've jumped into savagery, and we've recreated civilization. So like we're constantly bringing civilization to places where it's absent. Okay. And so what we find is that every time we recreate civilization, it's more democratic. It's more grounded by the people, where you've got a greater degree of equality. There's more liberty. Okay? So naturally, if we're crossing civilization, we're leaving civilization to go into the frontier, savagery, right? And we're starting civilization over. And as we recreate civilization, we're making it more democratic, right? We're making it more susceptible to equality and liberty and all that stuff, right? So is that a place people want to go? Absolutely. So as it says here, Eastern institutions were constantly being altered to become more democratic in order to prevent population loss to a more democratic West. So the East, where there's already civilization, they don't want to see the population move to the West. So what they have to do is they have to take their existing institutions and they got to make them more democratic so that the population won't leave and go to the West. There's no population loss. So you have this constant renewal. I like this word, this evolutionary process right here, this bullet, that you have this constant evolutionary process, that because we have frontier, the existence of frontier, it means that we're always going to have this line between civilization and savagery. And as Americans move into the frontier, they're rebuilding civilization that is better. It's more democratic. And so that forces this civilization in the East to reform and to also become more democratic in order to prevent population loss to the West. Okay? So, because of frontier, the U.S. American institutions throughout our history have undergone a constant state of evolution, like renewal. So as we go, we become more democratic. All right. Now Turner and his followers saw the frontier as having at least 6 noteworthy effects on American history. Okay, so I'd say this is pretty important, big part of this this presentation. The first effect that frontier had on American history is one, frontier serves as a melting pot. Assimilated immigrants broke down unique cultural differences of early immigrants. So, from his point of view, how can you make someone right off the boat from Europe, a new immigrant? How can you Americanize them? How can you force them to take on the characteristics of Native American or of native-born Americans? And that is kick them to the frontier, and that would help assimilate immigrants into Americans. Number 2, the frontier decreased our dependence on England, fostered the development of a manufacturing economy, and became impractical to transport British-made products deep into the heart of the continent. 3, the frontier championed the type of legislation enacted by the national government, creating a need for internal improvements and a protective tariff to being the factory to the farm. This necessitated a loose construction of the Constitution and to respond to the needs of the frontier. 4, the demand for cheap land led to dominance of the national government over the states by requiring survey and distribution of land and by admitting new states as civilization conquered savagery. Number 5, thank you. The frontier promoted democracy because the equality of the settlers there led to the establishment of more innovative and democratic institutions, which eventually worked its way back east. And finally, number 6, the frontier serves as a safety valve, siphoning discontent in the East and giving the disadvantaged the optimistic hope of bettering their lot. This created a more stable society by eliminating the need for the development of radical political doctrine in the eastern urban centers. So, one way that Turner and people who think like Turner, one argument they're going to give as to why is it that socialism never takes hold in the United States when it did in Europe. Why? Because we had factory, if you were discontent with the urban industrial East, if you were discontent with the excesses of capitalism and poverty, then there was always a place you could go to bettering your lot in life. And that's what the West represented. That's what, and because Europe lacked frontier, they didn't have frontier that their poor could escape to. Okay, so of course, as he says up here, because of frontier, we had loose construction. That's the reason. The reason why we did internal improvements, had a protective tariff, was all about the existence of frontier. So if you go back and look at everything, all the important forces that shaped the character of the United States and its people and its economy, Turner says it all, at the end of the day, is traced to the existence of frontier. And Americans constantly leaving civilization to go to savagery, and in the process, causing this evolutionary effect on the country. Now, undoubtedly, the frontier thesis broadened the view of American historians and provided a new, insightful way of viewing American history. The first generation of historians who followed Turner seemed to jump on the bandwagon and really worked hard to support his thesis. But gradually, critics began to emerge. In general, critics argued that Turner's thesis was at best oversimplistic and at worst factually flawed. So it's not, it is what it is. It's a frontier thesis. It's a theory. Theories are exactly what they are. People believe in theories. Some people try to disprove them, So he did have his critics. And so there were five major criticisms of the theory. One is that Frederick Jackson Turner failed to recognize the importance of the land speculator. That most land out west, most frontier land, was first settled by speculators or railroad companies. That speculators actually are going to be the first people into that savage land, not the pioneer. Okay. 2, settlement of land took place in times of prosperity, not hardship. So Turner believes that whenever life in the East gets unbearable, just go to the West. It's a safety valve. That's where you can go and start, hit the reset button. But some critics argue that much of the settlement of the land out West didn't take place in times of hardship, but in times of prosperity. 3, another criticism of the theory is that innovation and technology moved from east to west. Innovations demanded by the frontier served Eastern initiatives. Right? So reform movements and the need for increased democracy originated in Europe, in Eastern industrial cities. Classes developed quickly on the frontier, and they quickly took to de-individualizing activities. Okay, so big thing there is that if you argue that in the West you have a stronger degree of equality, there's more democracy. If you're looking to get away from the big bad capitalist urban society, you can go out west and find it and free yourselves of it. And one of the criticisms under number 3 is that first of all, when you go out west and say you arrive in Denver, Colorado, say in the year 1895, you will find that Denver is very much like New York, and that you have very regimented social classes, you have wealth, you have poverty. You have the same type of problems in Denver as you have in New York. 4, critics have eroded the notion that frontier settler was drawn to the frontier by an innate love of freedom and individualism. In fact, Western migration, they say, was motivated by the desire to acquire wealth, and it was commonly believed that wealth was more easily attainable on the frontier. Westerners desired much more help than Turner attributed to them, as evidenced by the communal existence in home building and the desire for government involvement in Indian fighting, internal improvements, and assistance in credit and banking. Critics argue that the fact that Westerners desired neighbors and culture and refinement in their communities is supported by the fact that as soon as practical, they took de-individualizing initiatives, de-initializing activities. So people did not, people did not go to savagery in search of freedom and liberty and democracy. Some critics argue that it was the lure of wealth that did so. Number 5, the frontier, the critics argue, did not serve as a melting pot. In fact, frontier settlers displayed a remarkable propensity to settle in ethnic groups and retain their cultural and ethnic identity. Okay, so essentially, for example, if you go to Texas and you go to the hill country in Texas, you'll find you have German communities who are trying to retain their old cultural identity as being Germans. So and you go to Wisconsin and you've got German communities there. You've got, so when you argue that the West can help assimilate immigrants, to a certain degree it did, but critics argue that in many communities, in many frontier settlements, there was a definite effort to retain much of their old culture as they could. So, of what importance is the frontier thesis in the study of American history? Historian Robert Rigel says, quote, "The question of whether Turner was correct or incorrect in his analysis of the influence of the frontier is very possibly less important than the fact that he turned men's minds from traditional and increasing sterile investigations to fields that were fresh and rewarding. The focus on the frontier serves as an additional perspective from which to study American history. To accept it blindly is probably no more useful than to reject it out of hand." So, and I think as historians, we're guilty of accepting either the critics and completely dismissing Turner, or blindly following Turner's thesis. So it's what makes it fun. It's what makes it fun. I think, part of what Frederick Jackson Turner is going to argue is, and for me, I think moving forward in this AP class, is the distinctiveness of Americans, the distinctiveness of the United States. What makes the United States different? What makes Americans different from Europeans and from other people around the world? And so there is an argument that could be made that the existence of frontier and the constant cycle of taming the frontier gave Americans attributes that people in Europe and around the world lack, cultural traits that they lack. So I go back and look at those ideals, individualism. Americans are more individualistic, materialistic, rigorous, hardworking, democratic, ingenious. As one historian argued, quite controversially, an American is a European perfected. Now, I know Europeans don't like hearing that. I don't think anybody wants, but one argument is that an American was viewed as a European perfected. And of course, again, that's very controversial to say, but in terms of understanding American identity and who we are as Americans compared to other people around the world, I don't think one can dismiss the impact of the frontier experience has in making us unique.